Good morning. I first became acquainted with our next speaker through the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. Back in 1995, as a first-year college professor of politics and history, I read an op-ed by Lehrman about my hero, Abraham Lincoln. It showed the connection between Lincoln's political and economic thought that was also informed by moral principle. Mr. Lehrman rightly observed that for Lincoln there was no opposition between labor and capital, but the key to economic growth was equal opportunity for all. For Lincoln, quote, people were the most important resource, not wealth, end quote. I learned later that this editorial was entered into the Congressional Record to help mark President's Day. This was just one of many honors that Mr. Lehrman has received because of his dedication to helping us remember our history. Whether writing newspaper and magazine articles, teaching at universities like Yale and Harvard, supporting organizations like the New York Historical Society and Intercollegiate Studies Institute, or establishing book prizes and educational websites, it's apparent that Lou Lehrman is not only a student of American history, he is also a teacher of it. And he has a special interest in seeing high school teachers across this country nurture and inform their passion for history. His latest contribution to teaching American history is a book about a politician who took American history seriously, a politician I consider to be the greatest teacher of the principles and practices of the American founding. That would be, of course, Abraham Lincoln. The book is entitled Lincoln at Peoria, The Turning Point, and it makes a convincing case that the ideas we most associate with Lincoln's political greatness emanate from a speech he delivered at Peoria, Illinois on October 16, 1854. This morning, Lou will help us understand the significance and impact of Lincoln's Peoria address. Please join me in welcoming the co-founder of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History and a longtime supporter of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, Mr. Louis Lehrman.
Thank you very much, Professor Morrell. Dr. Sellers, my dear friends, we shall never escape the burden and the glory of American history. Immortalized as it was on November 19, 1863, at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There, President Lincoln made his most celebrated reference to the Declaration of Independence. Once upon a time, every school boy, every school girl must recite 77 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It was in 1854 that the struggle for the equality principle of the Declaration of Independence came to preoccupy Abraham Lincoln. Thence until the day of his assassination. 1854 was the year of the extraordinary speech he gave in the evening of October 16th at Peoria, Illinois, during a day and night debate with Senator Stephen Douglas on the slavery issue. On this night, with many Southern-born men in the audience, Lincoln made an appeal to the authority of a slaveholding Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, but also to the universality of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, emphasizing its cornerstone, the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. Printed and widely read thereafter, this speech evoked the compelling arguments of Lincoln's future anti-slavery campaign, a political crusade Lincoln maintained until his death in 1865. The address at Peoria was designed to impeach the Kansas-Nebraska Act, an incendiary congressional statute of 1854, sponsored by the most famous national Democrat, the senior senator of Illinois, Stephen Douglas. This act had repealed the 1820 prohibition on slavery north of the 36-degree, 30-minute parallel of the vast Louisiana Purchase. Having turned free territory into potential slave territory, this radical legislation, Lincoln believed, had opened the way for slaveholders and their sympathizers to spread slavery throughout the American territories. Judging by its future consequences, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the trigger of civil war, may have been the most inflammatory statute ever passed by the Congress of the United States. But away back in Springfield, Illinois, there was an obscure former congressman, an old Douglas rival, watching the Illinois senators' bold maneuvers in Washington. After leaving Congress in 1849, Abraham Lincoln had substantially withdrawn from politics. As the Springfield attorney later wrote, I quote him, "I was concentrating on the law, even to the exclusion of politics. At that time, by horse and buggy, sometimes in the saddle, he ranged throughout the 8th Judicial District of Illinois, a windswept, forbidding prairie land, there trying cases from place to place on a circuit as large as the state of Connecticut. Amidst this back-breaking travel of his itinerant law practice, Lincoln undertook during the early months of 1854 intense research at the Springfield State Library. There, he mastered the historical evidence, the documentary evidence of the American founding, and especially the history of American slavery, evidence with which, at Peoria, he would indict Senator Stephen Douglas. On the portico in front of the Peoria courthouse, for 3 hours and 10 minutes, Lincoln would deliver the great Peoria speech, the arguments of which he would repeat until the day of his death. I shall summarize now those 3 hours. But very, very briefly, I promise. First, slavery was a moral wrong, as Thomas Jefferson and many of the founders have suggested. Slavery, Lincoln said, was a monstrous injustice. Second, the founders accepting slavery as a necessity in order to get the Union had, by subsequent legal precedents, put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction because it was a wrong. Third, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had prohibited slavery in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase, so that slavery, as the American founders intended, might continue in the course of ultimate extinction. Fourth, but now, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had overthrown the founders' anti-slavery sentiment, implied not only in the Declaration of Independence, but made explicit in many congressional restrictions on slavery. Fifth, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a radical policy because it had opened up new American territory to slavery, tending by law and precedent to turn the Declaration of Independence upon its head. That is to say, the act made slavery more national, thereby making freedom local and contingent, tending to reverse the founding spirit of national liberty. I should mention that before this Lincoln-Douglas debate at Peoria, Senator Douglas had demanded to speak first, and he did so for 3 hours. Whereupon, when Douglas finished, Lincoln stood up and announced, I quote Mr. Lincoln, "I do not arise to speak now, if I can stipulate with the audience to meet me here at 6:30 or 7 o'clock. Senator Douglas has already informed you that he is to have an hour to reply to me. I doubt not, but you have been a little surprised to learn that I have consented to give the senator, one of his high reputation and known ability, this advantage of me. Indeed, my consenting to it, though reluctant, was not wholly unselfish. For I suspected if it were understood that Senator Douglas was entirely done with his speech, you Democrats would leave and not hear me. But by giving him the close, I felt confident you would stay for the fun of hearing him skin me." In the cool of that autumn eve, at 7 p.m., Mr. Lincoln advanced to the portico of the Peoria courthouse and there addressed a vast throng of farmers, townspeople, visitors. I quote a mere fragment to convey Lincoln's mood. "Near 80 years ago, in 1776, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. But now, from the beginning, we have run down to the other declaration called popular sovereignty. That is, for some men to enslave others is a sacred right of self-government. These principles cannot stand together. They are as opposite as God and Mammon, and whoever holds to the one must despise the other." So you see, the Kansas-Nebraska bill had in 1854 focused the nation as never before on the pervasive institution of American slavery. The question was, given the immense political and economic power of the slave-based Cotton Kingdom, was it still possible to put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction? Or would it become permissible nationwide? It must be remembered that slave property in 1854 was the second largest source of wealth in America. That slave-based cotton exports exceeded the value of all other American exports combined. As a result, to put slavery in the course of ultimate extinction in 1854 was a project much more formidable than in 1776 at the formation of the Union, or in 1789 upon the implementation of the new Constitution. At Peoria, Lincoln therefore insisted that Congress, authorized by Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution, had the power and the duty to determine the status of slavery in the territories. Lincoln argued with some passion that the whole American people owned the territories, that the spread of slavery was not only a local, but also an overriding national issue, and that it was thus a congressional issue. Slavery was, above all, Lincoln declared, a moral issue. Why? Because, in a word, the Negro was a man, a human being, a fact that Senator Douglas demeaned with his race-baiting epithets, for example, everywhere, in 1854, calling Lincoln a black Republican. To plumb the moral energy of Lincoln's attitude at Peoria, it may be sufficient to hear a few more phrases from his speech there. I quote him: "Slavery is founded on the selfishness of man's nature, opposition to it in his love of justice. Repeal the Missouri Compromise, repeal all compromises, repeal the Declaration of Independence, repeal all past history. You still cannot repeal human nature. It still will be in the abundance of man's heart that slavery extension is wrong, and out of the abundance of his heart, his mouth will continue to speak." Then Mr. Lincoln went on to ground the argument in the logic and the history of the American founding. I quote Mr. Lincoln: "According to our ancient faith, the Declaration of Independence, the just powers of government are derived from the consent of the governed. Now, the relation of masters and slaves is pro tanto a total violation of this principle. The master not only governs the slave without his consent, but he governs him by a set of rules altogether different from those which he prescribes for himself. Allow all the governed an equal voice in government, and that only is self-government." So you see, in principle, Lincoln argued at Peoria that the consent of the governed, based on the equality doctrine of the Declaration of Independence, included black as well as white Americans. But in Illinois, then perhaps the most racist free state of the North, very few politicians in 1854 would venture so boldly as Mr. Lincoln. Indeed, Stephen Douglas's policy was indifference to slavery, declaring that his doctrine of popular sovereignty meant that he, Douglas, did not care whether or not Americans voted slavery up or down. Lincoln was scandalized by indifference to slavery, insisting, I quote Lincoln, that this declared indifference, but as I must think, covert, real zeal for the spread of slavery, I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our republican institutions of their just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, and causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity. Then in March 1857 came the infamous Dred Scott ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States, which held slavery to be a property right, as Jim Oakes so well pointed out earlier, and that this property right was protected in the territories by the Constitution of the United States. Lincoln rejected the Supreme Court decision as a rule of political action. maintaining, as he did earlier at Peoria, that with respect to slavery, the founders in 1776 and 1789 had yielded to necessity in order to forge a permanent union. That is to say, slavery, because it existed in the colonies, was necessarily there at the founding of the Republic. And at that moment, slavery could not be practically and immediately done away with. Now, in 1857, 3/4 of a century after the founding, the Dred Scott Supreme Court ruling, basing slavery in the property clause of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, or the potential to make slavery a lawful, a permanent, a national institution in the slave states, in the territories, even perhaps in the free states. Indeed, the Supreme Court had ruled in Dred Scott that neither Congress nor a territorial legislature had the congressional and constitutional authority to restrict slave property. In a series of stunning opinions, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney also wrote that the Negro was not and never could be an American citizen. I quote the Chief Justice, that the black man had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. The Supreme Court of the United States had now agreed with the argument of slavery expansionists, that if a man had a property right to bring his hog to Kansas, so too did he have the same property right to bring his Negro slave to Kansas. And no third man had a right to intervene. Then in 1858 came the third and most famous series of Lincoln-Douglas debates, for which Peoria was a prelude. Lincoln and Douglas met 7 times in a monumental rhetorical duel. Once more, the Declaration of Independence became a key point of contention. At Galesburg, Illinois, the site of the 5th debate, Senator Douglas, hoarse and exhausted, exclaimed, I quote him, "This Chicago doctrine of Lincoln's, declaring that the Negro and the white man are made equal by the Declaration of Independence and by divine providence, is a monstrous heresy." In the cold wind of that October day at Galesburg, Lincoln counterattacked. I quote him. Senator Douglas has alluded to the Declaration of Independence and insisted that Negroes are not included in that declaration, and that it is a slander upon the framers of that instrument to suppose that Negroes were meant therein. I believe the entire records of the world, from the date of the Declaration of Independence up to within 3 years ago, may be searched in vain for one single affirmation from one single man that the Negro was not included in the Declaration of Independence. And I will remind Judge Douglas and this audience that while Mr. Jefferson was the owner of slaves, as undoubtedly he was, in speaking upon this very subject, slavery, Jefferson used the strong language that he trembled for his country when he remembered that God was just. I do confess I have little doubt that Mr. Lincoln, a private citizen at Peoria in 1854, is all of a piece with the man who would be celebrated after 1865 as the great American statesman. The Peoria speech was the turning point for Mr. Lincoln, for the Illinois anti-slavery campaign, and thus a turning point for American history. There is, I believe, an unmistakable wholeness of character, genius, and enterprise to his public life, from Peoria in 1854 until his death in 1865. In 1854, however, the future president could not know what awaited him and his countrymen. But in 1861, President Lincoln did stress from the very beginning that he had sworn an oath on the Bible at his inauguration to preserve the Union. In his words, an oath registered in heaven. In order to fulfill that oath, after the Confederate attack upon Fort Sumter in April 1861, 4 years of brutal war and bloodshed ensued, whereupon the verdict of history would vindicate not only the literary and rhetorical genius of President Lincoln, but even the more so, the genius of his statecraft. With hindsight, we can now see that President Lincoln did know how to save the Union. But if victory and perpetuity of the Union were his original war aims, Lincoln would insist, as a sufficient condition for peace, that there would be no Union without emancipation. It is true that the future of bondage in America did remain in doubt throughout most of the Civil War. But Lincoln's reelection in November 1864 meant the ultimate extinction of slavery. At Appomattox in April 1865, General Lee surrendered, and with surrender, the slave-based economy of the South collapsed. Then in 1865 came the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. Slavery would be abolished. The promise of President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, had been made in January of 1863. The promise was kept and made forever in 1865. In the end, with malice toward none, President Lincoln had rebuilt the Union upon a rock of ages, the Declaration of Independence. Even the failures of Reconstruction and segregation could not extinguish the promise of constitutional equality for all American citizens. Inspired by President Lincoln and Union victory, the moral and legal framework of American fundamental law had been so reconstructed that at some future time, civil rights reforms might be enforced, as they would be about 1 century after President Lincoln's death. So, with the benefit of hindsight, what can the prudent historian say about the consequences for American history of Mr. Lincoln's victorious dedication to the Union and to emancipation? Today, we Americans rejoice that Lincoln's speeches roll down like thunder in the 20th century voice of Martin Luther King Jr. But we do well to remember it was Mr. Lincoln who defined the colorblind essence of the American dream. So I now quote Lincoln. "There is not, of necessity, any such thing as the free hired laborer being fixed in that condition for life. The prudent, penniless beginner in the world labors for wages a while, saves a surplus with which to buy tools or land for himself, then labors on his own account for a while, and at length hires another new beginner to help him. This is the just and generous and prosperous system which opens the way to all, gives hope to all, and energy and progress and improvement of condition to all." Lincoln's America was, in principle, a colorblind America. In New Haven, in March 1860, 1 year before his inauguration, Lincoln announced, I quote him, "I want every man to have the chance, and I believe a black man is entitled to it, when he may look forward and hope to be a hired laborer this year, and the next, work for himself, and finally to hire men to work for him." That is the true American system. It is fitting to say here in this place and now, at the historic election of 2008, the inauguration of Barack Obama, our 44th President of the United States, is the most recent legacy of Lincoln's Civil War victory and his 13th Amendment. Let Mr. Lincoln, therefore, in 1854, at Peoria, invoke his own legacy. I quote him, "Let us readopt the Declaration of Independence, and with it the practices and policy which harmonizes with the Declaration. Let North and South, let all Americans, let all lovers of liberty everywhere join in the great and good work. If we do this, we shall not only have saved the Union, but we shall have so saved it as to make and to keep it forever worthy of the saving. We shall have so saved it that the succeeding millions of free, happy people the world over shall rise up and call us blessed to the latest generations." Who will rightfully deny that President Lincoln's constitutional legacy has transformed American history? It was he who had accepted war in order to preserve the Union, and with war, to free the slaves. Without his leadership and his resolve, separate free and slave nations might have competed as hostile neighbors on this very continent. And thus, there might have been no integrated continental American economy based on free labor. But without continental American industrial power, which Lincoln self-consciously advocated, the industrial means would not have been available to contain Imperial Germany as it reached for European hegemony in 1914. Neither would there have been a united national power strong enough to destroy its successor, Hitler's Nazi Reich, nor to crush the aggressions of Imperial Japan. And in the end, there would have been no unified continental American power to contain and to overcome the communist empire of the second half of the 20th century. Nations based on the invidious distinctions of race and class, the defining characteristics of the malignant world powers of our era, were preempted by the force and leadership of the United States of America. Hovering over this whole extraordinary public history of our national pilgrimage, there lingers the enigma of this very private man and the shadow of his angular profile as it lengthened from Peoria throughout his presidency. We scrutinize Lincoln's character, but we see him through a glass darkly. So we mine his papers, sap the memoirs left by those who knew him, plumb his personal relationships. Still, he escapes us. Like a luminous comet, he had for a twinkling thrust himself and the Declaration of Independence before our eyes, the eyes of the entire world, then to vanish into the vasty deep whence he came. It's an honor to be among you. Thank you very much.
It's a great honor to hear your address. I grew up in Pekin, Illinois, 10 miles south, part of the 8th District where Lincoln practiced. Growing up there, and then at a later age, coming as most of you are for many years students of Lincoln, I come to it more recently. And in doing so, I recall that I went to DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana, which was the school that Albert Beveridge attended. And my elementary school in Pekin was named for Stephen Douglas. And I've tried to wrestle with Douglas. Douglas, who believed in the destiny of America, who believed in the greatness of the nation, who felt, just as Lincoln did, but from a different moral base, that America was going to be a beacon for the world. And he believed, however wrongly, that in doing what he did in '54 was going to address this tremendous dilemma that Jackson had faced, that Calhoun kept surfacing, that this nation would be able to go forward based on the principle of democracy, that the majority would rule, and that would be the great national beacon. And he presented that as his argument, remaining neutral on slavery so that this nation could build itself. Never saying that he wanted slavery ever to end, because he wanted the strong, united nation to be able to succeed. I think he was totally wrong, but I'd like you to comment on Douglas's vision and motivation, albeit it's wrong.
Well, well said, and thank you. May I first say that I do mention Pekin in my book.
Yes, you do.
And your remarks about Senator Douglas are also well taken, even those of Senator Beveridge. It is true that Senator Douglas aspired to a great nation. He was what you would call a screaming eagle nationalist, even more intense and vocal about his aspirations for American supremacy, probably than any other man so important in the age. It is also true that Senator Douglas believed that democracy, or in his doctrine, popular sovereignty, was the electoral mechanism by which to avoid the divisive issue of slavery. And he also invoked the rule of the majority as essentially the sole electoral mechanism by which democracy and popular sovereignty would make rules for America. Mr. Lincoln pointed out that Douglas's sincerity notwithstanding, that a free nation, a democracy, does not exhaust all of the principles by which it is governed when it gives the right to the majority exclusively and unequivocally to make rules for all. As Mr. Madison and Mr. Jefferson pointed out, the majority, in order to rule, must rule rightly. It must be governed by the organic law of the nation. The organic law of the nation at the founding, the Act of Union at the founding, was the Declaration of Independence. It was, in fact, the resolution of Congress which brought together the 13 colonies and made a nation. And thus it had a certain standing in law. And of course, Mr. Lincoln made the point in the line of succession of many of the founders that slavery was inconsistent and that no majority could rightly enact slavery as a national institution. That slavery was confined to those states which had embraced slavery through a domestic institution established by statute in that state, but that Congress had the authority to regulate the territories such that slavery would never be extended. Lincoln's argument being that the founders, in the vast majority, approximately 90%, he goes through the evidence in the Cooper Union speech, intended slavery never to be extended outside the states. And of course, he makes the point in the Peoria speech, which itself is worth reading. It certainly is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, of his speeches, in as much as it sets the scene. He makes the point that Congress has the authority by the Constitution to regulate slavery in the territory. And so since you haven't asked the question, but every time I've had to give a talk similar to this, I've had a skeptic say, well, by what constitutional doctrine does Congress have the authority to regulate slavery in the territory? Article 4, Section 3, new states may be admitted by the Congress into this union. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States of America. And nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice these claims. So that slavery was like, to use a homely analogy, the Cranberry Laws of Indiana. No federal government was permitted to intervene and regulate the Cranberry Laws that governed that were governed in the state of Indiana. Likewise, in the states where it existed, slavery, the southern states, because of course you know the northern states and all those north of the Ohio River had abolished slavery. In the southern states, they had embraced it by a locally enforceable domestic statute governing within that state and that state alone. And until the state itself would abolish slavery, the Constitution would respect it. With one more comment, there is in the Constitution of the United States, as Mr. Lincoln himself points out in several of his speeches, not least Peoria, there is no word slavery in any phrase or any sentence of the Constitution. The founders were ashamed of slavery, and the institution of slavery is referred to in the Constitution as a person held to service. Mr. Lincoln invokes this fact in order to show that the founders themselves were extremely self-conscious in declaring for the inalienable right to liberty and the equality of all men, very self-conscious in inaugurating the Constitution that there were persons held to service, otherwise slavery. So this longest answer on Douglas is that Senator Douglas limited his view of democracy such that the majority could enact any rule, including permitting some men to enslave others. Mr. Lincoln object.
Thank you.
We're thankful for Lou Lehrman's talk. We will now proceed.
We still have a little time left on the program, I do believe, and I'd like to just say, first, Lou, you've done a great service in your book on Lincoln at Peoria because it's a wonderful speech. I commend it to your attention. Every time I read it, I feel like standing up and cheering. It's one of his best speeches and deserves to be far better known than it is. But the leading biographer of our time, of Stephen A. Douglas, Robert W. Johansen, has argued in a book called Lincoln, the South, and Slavery that Lincoln's Peoria speech actually was not rooted in moral considerations, but was politically expedient. He could see that the political wind was blowing in the anti-slavery direction, and he decided to sail with it. Because otherwise, why would he have delayed so long in coming out against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which, after all, was introduced very early in 1854?
Well, Jim Oakes has already announced that Michael Burlingame is, without peer, the scholar of the life and times of Abraham Lincoln. And I will reciprocate and commend these two massive volumes to everybody in the audience. I mean, they are truly remarkable. So to go to Johansen and his view that Lincoln's Peoria speech in 1854 was largely an outgrowth of Lincoln's personal ambition. And he cites much evidence, in addition to what Professor Burlingame mentions, in addition to the fact that the Kansas-Nebraska Act had been introduced in January, and Mr. Lincoln's great Peoria speech isn't delivered until the evening of October 16th. Why did Mr. Lincoln wait so long? I have a great deal of sympathy for the reason why he waited too long. Mr. Lincoln did have a day job. And my own book, having made it very difficult for me to do my work and carry on my business, I notice if you look at the day-to-day schedule of Lincoln, and no one has looked at it more carefully than Professor Burlingame, so this is not to suggest to him. But if you look at that schedule, Mr. Lincoln was employed, earning a living to take care of his growing family, and he was not a rich man. He was, in 1854, a man of very modest means, just covering his expenses. Indeed, he talks about that, about how hard he must get at work in order to make a living. In addition, the Kansas-Nebraska, so there was this, I don't know, some people would call it a distraction, but some people would call it his primary vocation was to carry out his law practice, which was enormous. Another fact that Professor Burlingame makes a point of. I mean, he worked primarily for $2 and $3 and $4 and $5 fees, taking dozens, hundreds, even ultimately thousands of cases all over the state of Illinois, but primarily in the 4th Judicial District and appearing before the Supreme Court of Illinois, not to mention all of the county courts. So that that was a fundamental reason. Second reason was that the law itself was not signed into action, was not signed by the President of the United States until May 30th. Lincoln does appear in opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act in certain editorials in the Illinois State Journal, again, which Professor Burlingame, in his definitive work, cites as evidence that Lincoln was mentally engaged, his vocation notwithstanding, in opposing the Kansas-Nebraska Act very early on. He hits the campaign trail, however, in July and August, tentatively, September and October, actively, and appears in Springfield and Peoria with the summation of all that he had been saying in private, saying in certain editorials, and also saying in certain truncated versions which are reported in Basler's collected works. He emerges with the fully mature view at Springfield, Illinois on October 4th, and Peoria, October 16th. So I think that Johanson, in this very short essay where he speaks of this, in this very small book, takes advantage of those who really do not, are not able to bring to bear the evidence of Mr. Lincoln's intellectual and personal engagement in the anti-slavery exercise occasioned by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Thank you very much.